he discovered an Chinese woman completely hairless, nameless, and barefoot. She crouched behind the trading post like an injured creature, her skull shining ghostly beneath the merciless midday sunlight, utterly bald. Her limbs were crimson and torn. When Malachi Thorne initially spotted her, she attempted consuming leftovers from a swine feeding container. The vision halted him instantly. Throughout his countless years wandering between settlements, he'd witnessed abundant human suffering. Yet this proved distinct. The maiden appeared no older than 17, perhaps younger, and somebody had removed every strand from her head. Her garments were merely tattered fabric, ripped and soiled with substances he preferred not contemplating. Malachi advanced cautiously, like approaching a terrified stallion. "Steady now," he murmured gently. However, the maiden's head jerked upward, scrambling backward, flattening herself against the timber barrier. Her gaze held sheer panic, dark and vacant, as though she'd witnessed horrors that would shatter most souls. He observed her face bore bruises, purple and amber marks surrounding her jaw and temple. Recent wounds crossed her limbs. The manner she clutched her left side indicated someone had injured her severely. Yet her eyes affected him most profoundly. They contained no optimism, no resistance remaining, merely the vacant stare of someone who'd surrendered, never expecting kindness from existence. "I won't harm you," Malachi declared, kneeling to appear less menacing. He retrieved hardtack from his jacket pocket, extending it. The maiden gazed at the nourishment as though unable to believe its reality, then examined his face again, seeking the deception, the snare, the cruelty that would inevitably follow. When she finally reached toward the bread, her hand trembled so violently she could barely grasp it. She devoured it like she hadn't consumed food for days, possibly weeks, and Malachi felt something twist within his chest. He'd witnessed hungry individuals previously, but this was starvation. "What befell you?" he whispered, though she simply stared blankly. He attempted again in fragmentary Spanish, then his limited German knowledge. Nothing registered. The maiden completed the hardtack and regarded him expectantly, as though awaiting his demands for repayment. Behind them, footsteps approached. Malachi turned, observing Deputy Morrison advancing around the corner, his hand resting on his weapon belt. The deputy's expression hardened upon seeing the maiden. "Discovered our minor difficulty, did you?" Morrison stated coldly. "We've been seeking this one throughout the morning. Someone reported seeing a bald Chinese maiden stealing from the bakery." Malachi rose slowly, positioning himself between the deputy and the maiden. "She's injured. She requires assistance, not imprisonment." Morrison chuckled, though no humor existed. "Assistance, stranger. You don't comprehend what you're confronting. This one's brought nothing except trouble since appearing." He stepped closer, his gaze hard. "And folks are beginning to wonder about anyone who'd defend her." The threat lingered in the atmosphere like smoke from a gun barrel. Malachi could sense the maiden trembling behind him, realizing that whatever had occurred to her was far from concluded. Deputy Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon. "Step away from her, stranger. This maiden's got obligations to settle, and harboring a thief makes you complicit." Malachi felt the maiden press closer against his back, her breathing rapid and shallow. "What manner of obligations?" he inquired, maintaining his voice steady while his mind raced. Something about this entire situation felt wrong, like puzzle pieces that didn't connect properly. "The kind that gets resolved with labor," Morrison stated, his smile cold as winter. "Mr. Chen's been quite generous accepting her after she appeared half dead. She owes him for room, board, medicine. The minimum she can accomplish is working it off." The way Morrison pronounced work made Malachi's skin crawl. He'd witnessed company towns previously, locations where desperate individuals became trapped in debt cycles they could never escape. Yet this felt darker, more personal. "And if she cannot work?" Malachi pressed. Morrison shrugged. "Then she starves. Simple as that." He gestured toward the maiden. Observe her. Can't speak English. Can't tell us her origins or ownership. For all we know, she's diseased or mentally afflicted. The good people of this town shouldn't shoulder that burden. Malachi turned slightly to examine the maiden. Up close, he could see her baldness wasn't natural. Small nicks and cuts crossed her scalp, like someone had shaved her with a dull blade, hastily. Her eyes darted between him and Morrison. Though she couldn't understand the words, she clearly understood the threat. Perhaps I could settle her debt, Malachi declared suddenly, the words emerging before he'd fully considered them through. Morrison's eyebrows rose. You, a drifter with patched clothing and worn boots, wants to pay for damaged merchandise. He laughed again. Chen's not seeking pocket change, stranger. This maiden's debt runs deep. How deep? $50 plus interest that's been accumulating for weeks. Morrison's eyes glittered with malice. That's more currency than most folks see annually. Malachi's jaw tightened. $50 was indeed a fortune, especially for something as basic as medical care and shelter. It was the kind of debt designed never to be paid, a chain meant to hold someone in place forever. And if I cannot pay it all immediately? Malachi asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Then you become Chen's problem too, Morrison said simply. He's not in the charity business. You take responsibility for her. You take responsibility for her debt. And Chen has methods of collecting from people who don't pay. The maiden suddenly grabbed Malachi's coat, her fingers clutching the worn fabric desperately. When he looked down at her, she was shaking her head frantically, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't need to speak English to understand that these men were discussing her fate like she was livestock. Morrison stepped forward, reaching for the maiden's arm. Enough talk. She's coming with me. But as his hand neared her, the maiden released a sound that made both men freeze, a low, keening wail that spoke of pain so deep it had no words. She collapsed to her knees, wrapping her arms around herself and rocking back and forth. Morrison cursed and stepped back. See, touched in the head, nothing but trouble. Malachi knelt beside the maiden, his heart hammering. Whatever had been done to her, whatever had stripped away her hair and her voice and her hope, it was worse than he'd imagined. And now, he was the only thing standing between her and whatever fresh hell Morrison wanted to drag her back to. I'll find the money, Malachi said quietly, not taking his eyes off the maiden. Morrison's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Time, Chen's patience, ran out yesterday. You've got until sundown, stranger. After that, this maiden goes back where she belongs, and you'd better be long gone from this town. Morrison left them with a warning that echoed like thunder, sundown or else. Malachi watched the deputy's retreating figure, his mind working furiously. $50 might as well have been $500. He had maybe $3 to his name, and no prospects for earning more in a single afternoon. The maiden was still on her knees, but she'd stopped rocking. She looked up at him with those hollow eyes, and for the first time since he'd found her, something flickered there. Not hope exactly, but a desperate kind of attention, like she was trying to read his intentions in his face. I don't know how, but I'm going to help you, Malachi said softly. He didn't know if she understood his words, but maybe she could hear the promise in his voice. He helped her to her feet, noting how she winced when she put weight on her left leg. Her bare feet were worse than he'd first thought. Not just cut and bruised, but infected. Red streaks ran up from her toes, and he could smell the sickness starting to set in. First things first, he murmured, guiding her toward the main street. You need shoes and medical attention. But as they emerged from the alley, Malachi felt the weight of every stare. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Women pulled their children closer. Men's hands moved to their weapons. The maiden pressed closer to his side, making herself as small as possible. That's her, someone whispered. The diseased one. She's got some kind of oriental plague, another voice added. Malachi kept walking, His jaw set, but he could feel the hostility building like storm clouds. These people had already decided what the maiden was. A threat, a burden, something to be disposed of. And now he was guilty by association. They reached the doctor's office, a small building with painted letters on the window. Dr. Henley was a thin man with kind eyes. But when he saw the maiden, his expression changed. "I can't treat her," he said, before Malachi could even speak. Mr. Chen gave specific instructions. Any medical care has to go through him first, and he's made it clear that her account is closed. "She's sick," Malachi said, pointing to her infected feet. "Those cuts could kill her if they're not treated." "And I could lose my license if I go against Chen's orders," Dr. Henley replied, but his voice was heavy with regret. As they left the doctor's office, Malachi felt the maiden stumble. She was getting weaker, the infection and hunger taking their toll. Time was running out faster than he'd thought. "Malachi Thorne," a voice called from across the street. He turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching. Her dress was practical but well made. She had the look of someone who'd seen hard times but hadn't let them break her spirit. "I'm Mrs. Adelaide Crawford," she said. "I run the boarding house." She looked at the maiden with genuine concern. "I saw what happened in the alley. That child needs help." "I'm trying to help her," Malachi said carefully. "But it seems this town has already made up its mind about her." Mrs. Crawford's eyes hardened. "This town's made up its mind about a lot of things that aren't right." She glanced around, then stepped closer. "Chen's got half the men in town in his pocket, and the other half are too scared to cross him. But there are still some of us who remember what decency looks like." She pressed something into Malachi's hand, a small cloth pouch that clinked softly. "That's not enough to pay her debt, but it might buy you some time. And there's something else you should know about Mr. Chen and where that maiden really came from." Mrs. Crawford led them behind the boarding house, away from prying eyes and listening ears. The maiden moved slowly, each step clearly causing her pain, but she followed without complaint. Her silence wasn't just language, it was the quiet of someone who'd learned that making noise brought punishment. "Chen didn't rescue that maiden," Mrs. Crawford said, once they were alone. 3 weeks ago, a wagon train came through. Chinese workers heading to the railroad camps. One of their wagons broke down just outside town. Her voice dropped to a whisper. That maiden was in chains in the back of that wagon. Malachi felt something cold settle in his stomach. Chains, ankle, shackles, wrist irons. She wasn't a passenger, she was cargo. Mrs. Crawford's face was grim. The men said she was indentured, working off family debts. But I've seen enough of the world to know what that really means. The maiden was listening intently, even though she couldn't understand the words. Something in Mrs. Crawford's tone seemed to reach her, and tears began flowing down her cheeks. The first emotion Malachi had seen from her besides terror. When their wagon broke, they needed parts and repairs. Chen offered to take the maiden off their hands for a good price. Said he could use the help at his establishment. Mrs. Crawford's voice turned bitter. What he didn't mention was what kind of help he had in mind. Malachi's hands clenched into fists. And the town just let it happen? The town doesn't ask questions about Chen's business. He owns the saloon, the brothel, half the shops on Main Street. He brings money and jobs, so people look the other way. Mrs. Crawford touched the maiden's shoulder gently. But this child fought back. That's why she looks like this. He had her head shaved to mark her as troublesome, kept her locked up, barely fed her. How did she escape? 3 days ago, there was a fire in Chen's back rooms. In the confusion, she got away. Mrs. Crawford's eyes were hard. He's been hunting her ever since, claiming she owes him for her care and lodging. But really, he just wants his property back. The maiden suddenly grabbed Malachi's arm, her eyes wide with fresh terror. She was pointing past Mrs. Crawford's shoulder toward the street. Following her gaze, Malachi saw two men walking purposefully toward them, Chen himself and another man Malachi didn't recognize. Both armed. Chen was a stocky man with cold eyes and expensive clothes that seemed out of place in this frontier town. His companion was taller, meaner looking, with the kind of scars that spoke of a life lived violently. "Mrs. Crawford," Chen called out in accented English. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Mrs. Crawford stepped protectively in front of the maiden. "She doesn't belong to anyone, Chen. She's a human being, not livestock." Chen's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "She is indentured servant with legal debt. I have papers." He patted his coat pocket. "Very expensive to transport from California. Very expensive to feed and house. She must work to repay." "What kind of work?" Malachi asked, though he already knew the answer would make him sick. "Whatever work I need done," Chen replied smoothly. "Cleaning, cooking, serving customers. Very simple." The lie hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew what Chen really meant, but saying it out loud would force them all to confront an ugly truth they'd been avoiding. The maiden pressed closer to Malachi, her whole body trembling. In that moment, he realized that whatever choice he made, there would be no going back. Chen wasn't going to walk away empty-handed, and Mrs. Crawford had just made herself a target by standing up to him. Time slowed as Malachi weighed his options, knowing that in the next few seconds, someone's life was going to change forever. Malachi stepped forward, placing himself directly between Chen and the maiden. "She's not going anywhere with you." Chen's companion, the scarred man, moved his hand to his gun. "That's a mistake, stranger." "Maybe," Malachi said quietly. "But I've made worse ones and lived to tell about it." The tension crackled like electricity before a storm. Mrs. Crawford grabbed the maiden's hand, ready to pull her to safety, but Chen raised his hand to stop his companion from drawing. "You are a reasonable man, yes?" Chen said to Malachi, his tone suddenly conversational. "You understand business. This maiden cost me much money. Transportation, food, medicine when she was sick. Now she runs away before paying debt. This is theft." "Theft?" Malachi's voice was dangerously quiet. "A man who buys human beings wants to talk about theft." Chen's mask of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and cruel underneath. "I have legal papers. Signed contract. She works 7 years to pay family debt, then she free. This is law." "7 years?" Mrs. Crawford spat. "At the rate you were planning to work her, she'd be dead in 1. Chen shrugged, as if human life was just another business calculation. Perhaps she should have thought of that before her family borrowed money they could not repay. The maiden suddenly spoke for the first time since Malachi had found her. It was just one word, barely audible, but it hit like a thunderclap. "Please." Everyone turned to stare at her. Her English was broken, heavily accented, but the desperation in her voice was universal. "Please, no go back." Chen's face darkened. "You see? She speaks English. She understand everything. She choose to run away, choose to steal from me. Now she must pay consequences." "What's your name?" Malachi asked the maiden gently. She looked terrified to answer, glancing nervously at Chen. "Li Mei," she whispered. "Li Mei," Malachi repeated. And something about hearing her name spoken with kindness made her straighten slightly. 16, she said, the word barely audible. 16. Malachi felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire. This child had been sold into slavery, transported across the country like cattle, and now Chen wanted to drag her back to whatever hell he'd prepared for her. "The debt's not hers," Malachi said suddenly. "It's her family's debt, right? She's just collateral." Chen nodded slowly, suspicious of where this was heading. "Then someone else can take it on," Malachi continued. "Transfer the contract to me. I'll work off her debt." Chen laughed, but there was surprise in it.
You?
You have no money, no property. What can you offer me? Malachi reached into his coat and pulled out something that made Chen's companion take a step back. A worn leather holster with a gun that had seen considerable use. But more importantly, he pulled out a small metal badge that caught the afternoon light. "I'm a former U.S. Marshal," Malachi said, quietly, "and I know exactly what kind of business you're really running here. So here's my counteroffer. You let Li Mei go, and I don't wire the territorial authorities about your operation." Chen's face went white, then flushed red with anger. The game had just changed completely. "You have no proof," Chen said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "Don't I?" Malachi smiled grimly. "I've been tracking operations like yours for 3 years, missing persons reports. Families looking for children who disappeared into the railroad camps. I think the authorities would be very interested in your paperwork." The scarred man's hand was now hovering over his gun. "Boss, just give the word." But Chen was calculating odds, weighing risks. A dead marshal would bring unwanted attention, questions that couldn't be bought off. And if Malachi really had been tracking him, "This is not over," Chen said finally, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You have no idea what you've started." Chen and his companion backed away, but their eyes promised this wasn't finished. As they disappeared around the corner, Mrs. Crawford let out a breath she'd been holding. "A marshal," she said, looking at Malachi with new respect. "That explains why you didn't run when Morrison threatened you." "A former marshal," Malachi corrected, tucking the badge back into his coat. "I resigned 3 months ago." His voice carried a weight that spoke of personal tragedy. Sometimes the law isn't enough to protect people who need protecting. Li Mei was staring at him with something approaching awe. For the first time since he'd found her, she wasn't looking over her shoulder in terror. "You save me?" she asked in broken English. "For now," Malachi said. "Chen's right about one thing, this isn't over. He's got too much invested to just walk away." Mrs. Crawford nodded grimly. "Chen owns half this town, and the half he doesn't own, he has leverage on. Deputy Morrison's been taking his money for years. Even if we got Li Mei out of town, Chen would just send men after her." "Then we don't run," Malachi said quietly. "We end this." "How?" Mrs. Crawford asked. "You're one man against Chen's entire operation." Malachi looked at Li Mei, who was listening intently despite the language barrier. "Tell me about the fire," he said to her. "The one where you escaped." Li Mei's face clouded with memory. I start fire," she said haltingly. "Chen, he hurt other girl younger. I try stop him, but he lock me up, so I burn his papers." "Papers?" Malachi's interest sharpened. "What kind of papers?" "Names," Li said, struggling with the English. "Many names. Girls, boys, where they come from, where they go, and money papers. Who he pay, who pay him." Mrs. Crawford gasped. "She destroyed his records." Li Mei nodded. "He very angry. Say I cost him much money. That why he want me back so bad. Not just for work, he need to punish me, show others what happen if they fight." Malachi felt pieces clicking into place. "That's why he's so desperate. Without those records, he can't track his other victims or collect on his debts. And if the territorial authorities ever got their hands on those names, his whole operation would collapse," Mrs. Crawford finished. A commotion from the street interrupted them. Angry voices getting closer. Through the window they could see a crowd gathering, led by Deputy Morrison and several of Chen's men. "Thorne." Morrison's voice boomed across the evening air. "Come out here. You've got some explaining to do." Mrs. Crawford peered through the curtains. "There's at least a dozen men out there. Chen's been spreading word that you're harboring a dangerous criminal. Lai Mei pressed against the wall, her brief moment of hope evaporating. "They come for me," she whispered. "No," Malachi said firmly. "They're coming for me. Chen knows I'm the real threat now." He checked his gun, then looked at Mrs. Crawford. "Is there a back way out of here?" "Yes, but where would you go? This is the only town for 50 miles in any direction." "Thorne," Morrison called again. "I've got warrants here, harboring a fugitive, interfering with legal business. Come out now, or we're coming in." Malachi moved to the window and looked out at the crowd. Some faces he recognized from earlier: shopkeepers, workers, ordinary people who'd been convinced that Li was a threat to their community. Others were clearly Chen's hired guns, men who'd do whatever they were paid to do. "There's something else," Li said suddenly. Her voice urgent. "Papers I save hide before fire." She reached into her tattered clothing and pulled out a small water-stained piece of paper. Names of men in town who pay Chen deputies, judges, business owners. Mrs. Crawford took the paper, her eyes widening as she read. This is half the town council. The mayor's name is on here. The sheriff, too." Malachi understood now why Chen was so confident, why he could operate openly in this town. He didn't just own businesses, he owned the people who made the laws. "That's our way out," Malachi said. "But first, we have to survive the next few minutes." The front door rattled as someone tested the handle. Morrison's voice came again, closer now. "Last warning, Thorne. Open this door or we'll break it down." Li Mei grabbed Malachi's arm. "I go with them," she said desperately. "Save you trouble. I already dead inside anyway." "No," Malachi said fiercely. "Nobody else dies on my watch. Not anymore." The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters, and Deputy Morrison stepped through with his gun drawn, backed by 6 armed men. "Hands up, all of you." But as Morrison's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, he found himself staring down the barrel of Malachi's gun. "I've got a better idea, Deputy. How about you and your friends back out of here real slow, and we'll talk about this like civilized people." Morrison's hand tightened on his weapon. "You're outnumbered 6-1, Thorne. Don't be a fool." 7-1, a new voice said from the doorway. But who's counting? The voice belonged to Dr. Henley, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood the blacksmith, the telegraph operator, and 3 other townspeople Malachi didn't recognize. All were armed, and none looked like they were there to help Morrison. "What the hell is this?" Morrison snarled, swinging his gun between Malachi and the newcomers. "It's called a reckoning," Dr. Henley said calmly. "We've been watching Chen's operation for months, waiting for someone with the backbone to stand up to him. When Mrs. Crawford told us about Marshal Thorne here, we decided it was time to act." Morrison's face went pale. "You're all making a big mistake. Chen's got legal papers." "Chen's got nothing but forged documents and bought officials," the blacksmith interrupted. "We've seen that list, Morrison. We know exactly how much Chen's been paying you to look the other way." Li pressed closer to Mrs. Crawford, overwhelmed by this sudden turn of events. These people, strangers who'd avoided her all day, were now risking their lives to protect her. Morrison's eyes darted around the room, calculating odds. "Even if that's true, you can't prove anything. Chen's word against yours." "Actually, we can prove quite a lot," Dr. Henley said. He pulled out a telegram. "I sent word to the territorial capital this afternoon. Seems there's been a federal investigation into human trafficking along the railroad routes. They're very interested in talking to Mr. Chen." Chen himself appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with rage. "Enough," he shouted. "This maiden is my property. I have contract. You have a piece of paper that says a 16-year-old child can be owned like livestock." Malachi said, his gun never wavering from Morrison. "Last I checked, we fought a war to settle that question." "This different," Chen protested. "This legal indenture. Her family owe money. Her family never saw a cent of your money, Dr. Henley said quietly. We've been asking questions, Chen. Sending telegrams. Li Mei's family was murdered by bandits 2 months ago. You bought her from the men who killed them. The words hit Li Mei like a physical blow. She collapsed to her knees, a sound of pure grief tearing from her throat. Mrs. Crawford knelt beside her, holding her as she sobbed for the first time since Malachi had found her. Chen's mask finally slipped completely. So what? She was already dead to world. I give her purpose, place to live, better than dying in gutter. You turned her into a slave, Malachi said, his voice deadly quiet, and you were going to do worse. Morrison made his move then, swinging his gun toward Malachi. But the former marshal was faster. Morrison's weapon flew from his hand as Malachi's bullet shattered his wrist. Shen's men reached for their guns, but found themselves facing 7 determined townspeople who'd finally decided to take their community back. It's over, Chen, Dr. Henley said. The federal marshals will be here tomorrow. You can come quietly, or you can try to run. But either way, your business in this town is finished. Chen looked around the room, seeing his empire crumbling. His breathing was ragged, desperate. You think this ends anything? There are dozens more like me. Hundreds of children already gone. You save one maiden, but you change nothing. We changed everything for her, Malachi said simply. Sometimes that's enough to start with. Chen's hand moved toward his coat, and Malachi tensed. But the man only pulled out a set of keys. He threw them at Li's feet with contempt. Keys to wagon outside. Take your precious maiden and go. But remember, world is full of men like me. She will never be truly safe. Li Mei looked up at the keys, then at Malachi. Now, Mrs. Crawford said gently, you get to choose your own life. 3 days later, Li Mei stood in front of a mirror at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house, running her hand over the soft stubble beginning to grow on her scalp. Dr. Henley had treated her infected feet, and proper food had already begun to put color back in her cheeks. She was wearing a simple dress that Mrs. Crawford had altered to fit her, and for the first time in months, she looked like what she was, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. The federal marshals had arrived as promised, arresting Chen and 3 of his associates. Deputy Morrison was facing charges for corruption and would likely spend the next decade in prison. The investigation had uncovered a network of human trafficking that stretched across 3 territories, and Li Mei's testimony would be crucial in bringing down the entire operation. Malachi found her in the boarding house garden, tending to Mrs. Crawford's vegetables. She'd shown an instinct for growing things, as if nurturing life helped heal something inside her that had been damaged. The marshals want to speak with you again tomorrow, he said gently. About the other maidens you remember from the camps. Li nodded, her English already improving after just a few days of being treated like a human being instead of property. I tell them everything. Help them find others. She paused in her work, looking up at him. Malachi had been dreading this conversation. The marshals had offered him his badge back, a chance to rejoin the fight against men like Chen. It was important work, necessary work, but it would mean leaving Li Mei just when she was starting to heal. I don't know yet, he admitted. What would you like me to do? Li Mei was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. In China, before bad men come, my family have farm. Small farm, but good life. I know how to grow things, how to make things live. She gestured around Mrs. Crawford's garden. Mrs. Crawford say she need help with boarding house. Say maybe I stay here, work for real wages, save money. That sounds like a good plan, Malachi said. She also say you good man with no place to call home. Li Mei's eyes met his. Maybe you tired of chasing bad men, maybe time to help good things grow instead. Malachi felt something shift inside his chest, a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider. For 3 years he'd been driven by anger and guilt, hunting men like Chen because he'd failed to save his own family from similar monsters. But Li Mei was right. Maybe it was time to build something instead of just tearing down what was broken. Mrs. Crawford mentioned she's been thinking about expanding, he said carefully. Maybe adding a stable, growing more of their own food. She'd need someone who knows horses, someone who can handle the rougher work. Li Mei smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. She also mentioned town need new sheriff. Real one this time. One who protect people instead of taking money from bad men. You've been having quite a few conversations with Mrs. Crawford, Malachi observed. She, good woman. She teach me many things about America, about what freedom mean. Lin Mei's expression grew serious. But most important thing she teach me is that some people, when they save you, they not want to own you. They want to see you become who you meant to be. 6 months later, Sheriff Malachi Thorne stood in the same spot where he'd first found Li Mei, but now it was the site of a thriving market garden that supplied fresh vegetables to half the town. Li Mei had become Mrs. Crawford's business partner, and together they'd transformed the boarding house into a refuge for travelers and workers who needed a safe place to stay. Li Mei's hair had grown back in thick black waves that she wore in a simple braid. She'd gained weight and confidence, and her English was now fluent enough that she'd started teaching other immigrants who passed through town. "Sheriff," she called out, waving from where she was training a new arrival, another young woman who'd been rescued from a trafficking ring 2 states over. "Mrs. Crawford say dinner in 1 hour. You bring appetite." Malachi touched the badge on his chest, properly earned this time, elected by people who trusted him to protect them rather than exploit them. The work was different from his marshal days, less dramatic, but more meaningful. He was building something lasting instead of just solving temporary problems. As he walked toward the boarding house, he could smell Mrs. Crawford's cooking and hear Li Mei laughing with her student. The sound of that laughter, free and genuine and alive, reminded him every day why some fights were worth having. Li Mei had been right about one thing: the world was full of men like Chen. But it was also full of people like Mrs. Crawford and Dr. Henley and the townspeople who'd stood up when it mattered. And sometimes, saving one person really was enough to start changing everything. The maiden with no hair, no name, and no shoes had become Li Mei Crawford Thorne, citizen, business owner, and teacher. She'd found her voice, her strength, and her place in the world. And in saving her, Malachi had found his way home.